Okay, so the first question might be, why are they called restoration colonies? I think the answer to that question actually illustrates the point we were making about the old world being connected to the new world still. That events in the old world impact the new world. They're called restoration colonies because these colonies are founded after the King of England is restored. Right? After the king is restored. We mentioned the English Civil War. Remember, the Puritans and King Charles find themselves in civil war in 1642. The Puritans win in 1649. They execute the king. Right? They put their own ruler in place. They're going to rule England for about 9 years. But in 1658, Oliver Cromwell dies, and many in England decide, you know what, maybe we're better off back under a king. Right? Maybe we're better off restoring the monarchy. Right? Restoring the monarchy, which is what they're going to do. They're going to put Charles II in power, and Charles II is the one that's going to found several colonies. The colonies he founds will be called restoration colonies. So again, what's happening in the old world continues to impact us here in the new world. I just want you to think about that connection between past and present. One of the things that Charles is going to try to do is to re-exert British control over her colonies, to kind of rein us in a little bit. Now, this is kind of foreshadowing, right? Because England's attempt to sort of rein us in eventually will lead us to the American Revolution, right, which we'll get at pretty soon. Next week we'll be talking about that. What's an example of them trying to rein us in? Well, one example is going to be this Act of Trade and Navigation that's passed in England in 1651. Act of Trade and Navigation. So I'll say something about that really quickly, and we'll get to these colonies and go through them really quickly. An Act of Trade and Navigation is basically the attempt for England as the mother country to kind of control us colonies as her children. Right? Think mother country and children. Think about a relationship between a parent and a child, right? Child is supposed to do what the parent says. Right? The child is supposed to follow orders, essentially. So England looks at us as children. And for the most part, we're like, okay, that's kind of how it went. You founded us, blah, blah, blah. But what happens when those children start to grow up? Right? That relationship will be strained a bit. Maybe it's going to be redefined a bit. I don't know if you all are anything like me, but I loved my mom to death. But as I got older, the relationship started to change a little bit. And from her perspective, the relationship did not change. As far as she was concerned, didn't matter how old I was always going to be her baby. But when I got to be 17 and I'm counting down the days to where I could get out of the house, literally counting down the days when I was going to be going off to college, she didn't see me as a 17-year-old about to go off to college. She saw me as a baby. Right? And that can be frustrating. Right? That can be frustrating, especially when you feel like you're more independent, when you feel like you can make your own decisions, right? When you feel like you don't necessarily need somebody telling you what to do. So think about this colonial relationship kind of like that. That's eventually what's going to develop here. So what does England try to do? Well, they will pass this Act of Trade and Navigation in 1651. It was designed to, specifically, it was designed to exclude Dutch traders from being able to trade with the colonies. From England's perspective, they're like, look, you are British colonies. Why should you be trading with the Dutch? You exist to help the mother country. And from England's perspective, it was our patriotic duty to support the nation, right? We only existed to make the mother country rich and powerful and then be better able to compete with the other nations of Europe. We were supposed to simply provide raw materials to the mother country and buy products from the mother country in order to make the nation great. But eventually we start to grow up, we start to think for ourselves, we start to question whether certain policies might be helping the mother country but not helping us. This eventually is going to lead to revolution because we're becoming American even before we know it. We wouldn't have used that term yet, but we're becoming American. I would argue we're becoming almost a separate imagined community. So this Act of Trade and Navigation is kind of an attempt to control. It's an attempt at control. It's supposed to exclude the Dutch from trade. The significant part about this is that there are going to be several laws on the books as early as the 1600s. But by the 1700s, by the mid 1700s, these laws are going to start to irritate us. They had always been there. They hadn't always been enforced. They had always been there. They hadn't always been enforced. I have an 8-year-old son, and right now he's on summer vacation. Now, I have sleep apnea and some other issues, so I can fall asleep right now if I stop talking. I can fall asleep standing up. I can fall asleep sitting up on the couch. My son can stay up all night, but he has a bedtime of 8 o'clock. But he's not in school right now. We're not really enforcing it, right? He's staying up till 10, 10:30. Sometimes I fall asleep and wake up and he's watching me, right? And it's midnight. I'm like, dude, you got to go to sleep. He's good. Once his cartoons are on, he's got the iPad, he can stay up all night. Now, when school starts again, we're going to have to get him back on a regular schedule. And usually around that time, we start to have some conflict. No, I don't want to go to sleep. Right? His head starts spinning around. Why? Because he's used to staying up, right? Now, technically, his bedtime has always been 8 o'clock, but we haven't been enforcing it. It's when we start to try to enforce it that suddenly he's going to resist that. Same thing is going to happen in terms of these colonies, as we'll see. But again, this act of trade and navigation has been there at least since the 1650s. So we'll see this develop later on. We'll come back to that part of the story. Think about this colonial relationship almost as a parent-child relationship. So Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658. Charles is really thinking about the New World and developing colonies, developing England's strength overall. And he is going to found several restoration colonies, kind of largely based on the model of Maryland. Many of them are going to have a lot in common with Maryland. One of his most important acts, you could argue, is the founding of these restoration colonies. For example, in 1663, right, in 1663, he will found the first of the restoration colonies. It's going to be the new colony of Carolina. The new colony of Carolina. It wasn't initially North and South Carolina, it was just Carolina. So Carolina is the first. It stretched from Virginia south to Spanish-controlled Florida, down to Spanish-controlled Florida in the south. Right, so it's kind of below Virginia all the way down to Florida. By about 1675, North Carolina, as it had become known, had about 5,000 small farmers and large tobacco planters. So North Carolina also is going to be invested in tobacco. Any sports fans think about the rivalry between, say, Duke and North Carolina in college basketball, right? When they're talking about that rivalry, they'll often talk about Tobacco Road, right? And how the colleges are very close and they're both along Tobacco Road, right? Tobacco is going to be central to the identity of North Carolina specifically. Settlement further south is going to start to develop as well, right? Especially after 1670. With the founding of a town named after the king, Charlestown. Charlestown is founded after 1670. Now say that 5 times fast. Charlestown, Charlestown, Charleston, South Carolina. Right. Again, think about people naming things that are familiar, naming things after themselves, making home kind of a familiar thing. Now South Carolina is an interesting and another unique colony. I know I keep saying that these colonies are unique, but they all seem to be unique in several ways. But South Carolina especially is unique. It was called a colony of a colony. It was called a colony of a colony because most of South Carolina's British settlers moved from another British colony. They came from the colony of Barbados, the Caribbean colony of Barbados. Now, Barbados was a slave colony that the British had started in 1627. So this is going to be significant for this reason. Imagine you're a slave-holding family, British family in Barbados. Let's say you have a husband, wife, 2 kids, an overseer. You decide, you know what, let's move to South Carolina. Let's pick up and move our plantation to South Carolina. You're going to have some interesting population dynamics develop. Right? You're going to have some interesting population dynamics because if there are 5 of you moving and you bring your 300 slaves with you, that's going to cause an interesting population dynamic. Imagine 1,000 slaveholders all pick up and bring their plantations to South Carolina. You're going to have some interesting population dynamics in South Carolina. Parts of South Carolina will have an African majority in the 1600s. Parts of Charleston and surrounding areas might be as high as 65% black. That's going to look different than any other colony. It's not a surprise then that you have some of the first slave revolts, our earliest slave revolts, or most scariest, I guess, slave revolts, like the Stono Rebellion in 1739 and some others. So South Carolina looks different, North Carolina looks different. All of them are restoration colonies, technically, because they happen under King Charles after he's restored the throne, the monarchy. They mentioned the colony of New Netherland. New Netherland is interesting because, again, Old World impacts New World. Britain and the Dutch don't get along, right? So New Netherland, which extends from Albany down the Hudson to the island city of New Amsterdam, is controlled by the Dutch. It's controlled by the Dutch. Where is Albany? What state is Albany the capital of? Exactly. New York. All right, so New Netherland extends from Albany down the Hudson to New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is now Manhattan Island. So King Charles is looking at this New Netherland colony. He's kind of like, I want that. Give me that. But this is an interesting colony for a lot of reasons. The Dutch had a presence there, right? They had forged trading alliances with native peoples, especially the Iroquois living in the area. There have been several native wars in the area around trade and around diplomatic relations among and within native peoples. In 1655, the Dutch had overwhelmed a smaller Swedish community in the area and kind of taken charge. Right? So I want you to think about how these dynamics all will cause a very complicated situation in New York. Right? 1655, the Dutch take it from the Swedes. The Swedes have a presence there. Native Americans have been there forever. New York will have a 20% African population as early as the 1600s. It's going to be one of the earliest Jewish populations there. Think about the New York accent to this day. Many linguists say it has a lot to do with the Dutch influence, right? Native American influence, African influences. Right? So past continues to impact the present. New York, as it's going to later become called after the British take it in 1664, is going to be the most diverse colony. Right? The most diverse colony. So Charles is eyeing, and he's like, let's do this. Let's take this. In 1664, he decides to eliminate Dutch competition in North America, and an English fleet will force the surrender of New Amsterdam. There are going to be several kind of Anglo-Dutch clashes, but the English will take this area. They will rename the colony New York. New York. New York is named in honor of Charles's brother, James. James was the Duke of York. So that's where the name New York comes from. Again, New York becomes the most heterogeneous colony, most diverse colony in North America. I think about all these cultural influences, Native American, Dutch, Swedish, Jewish, African. I mean, there's all sorts of things happening in New York. In 1674, the colonists were granted the status of English subjects, and you're going to continue to see growth in this area. For example, the communities of the Delaware Valley became the colony of New Jersey in 1665. So New Jersey's kind of like carved off in 1665. It would be governed by New York until the 1680s. So New Jersey's kind of a smaller outpost, very small population early on. Even later, it's still going to have a very small population until modern times. In 1676, ownership rights to the western part of New Jersey would be sold to a group of English Quakers. So the western part of New Jersey is going to be sold to a group of English Quakers. Quakers are a religious group, a religious sect, it's often called, right? A persecuted often, religious sect. Perhaps most famous is William Penn. William Penn, the Quaker. Now, William Penn is the son of Sir William Penn, and Sir William Penn was a close advisor to the king. The next year, the younger Penn is granted territory west of Delaware, building the town of Philadelphia. Think Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, William Penn has certain ideas in mind for what Philadelphia should be like. He says that it should be a holy experiment. And in some ways, you can see that he's kind of influenced perhaps by these Puritans. Right? He wants Pennsylvania or Philadelphia to be a holy experiment, to be different than some of the other colonies in certain ways. So what would this holy experiment look like? Well, Penn wants to guarantee religious freedom. Right? This makes it pretty radical, right? Guarantee religious freedom. He himself is a Quaker. That may have influenced that, right? So he feels people shouldn't be persecuted based on their religious identity. He wants to guarantee civil liberties, elected representation. He also attempted to deal fairly with the Algonquian natives in the area. He says, think about the Roger Williams influence, right? You got to treat people fairly. You have to bargain for land. In fact, he refused to permit colonization until settlement rights had been negotiated and lands purchased from native peoples. So actually, early Philadelphia, early Pennsylvania has pretty good relationships with natives, better than Virginia, better than Massachusetts, right, because of this sort of early foundation. Now, after Penn dies, things might go a different direction, right, but early on, they tend to have much better relationships. In 1682, he would make an agreement with the local native leader, Chief Tammany. Chief Tammany, again, kind of showing he was the sachem or the leader of the area, the Delaware society. Tammany, that may be a name you've heard if you study 19th century U.S. history, because that name Tammany becomes a symbol of sort of democracy and freedom. Right? Tammany Hall would be the name of the New York sort of political machine. They called it Tammany Hall. During its first decade, more than 10,000 colonists would arrive. In 1704, a separate government for the area, later known as Delaware, would be granted. So think about how these places are kind of hiving off too, right? These restoration colonies are being kind of created in this period. Philadelphia is going to be one of the more important colonial ports in our history, right? It's going to be a very important city, Ben Franklin and all that associated with Philadelphia. I think freedom, Liberty Bell, that kind of stuff. So these middle colonies are important. We don't want to, completely skip over them. But what we've done is kind of lay out essentially three different regions, right? Think about New England and its identity. Think about the Chesapeake and its identity. And then these middle colonies and how in some ways they are similar to and different from what we've seen before. Now the textbook and several sources will talk about the conflict and war in this period. I'm just going to summarize this very quickly because what I want you to take from this is that, one, there's a lot of conflict and war. Right? There's a lot of conflict and tension, but I'm not an expert in military history. First of all, I wish I was because it's some interesting stuff, but we wouldn't have had time to go through the battles regardless. There are 8,000 battles in the Civil War, for instance. There's no way we would have time to deal with that. What we have to do is deal with the kind of significance of these events, especially what leads to them and what comes out of them. So what I want you to think about in terms of this period of conflict and war is what leads to it, and importantly, what comes out of it. So some of the conflicts and war that will be mentioned: King Philip's War, right, 1675, 1676. The text will talk about that. King Philip, whose actual name was Metacomet, the British called him King Philip, is going to be a conflict between natives and surrounding settlers. That's the very same year as Bacon's Rebellion. We mentioned Bacon's Rebellion quickly yesterday when we were talking about the laws of Virginia. Remember, Nathaniel Bacon is a British settler, comes to Jamestown. He wants access to land. He's told, no, you can't have any land. There's no land left. Right? The land belongs to the natives that's left. So Bacon decides that's not good enough, gets an army behind him, and they start attacking natives. When the government of Jamestown tries to stop him, he turns on the government of Jamestown. It's essentially a revolution. They burned Jamestown to the ground in 1675, 1676, and many see this as a tipping point away from indentured servitude, right? That some are like, uh-oh, right? Maybe it's not such a good idea to try to enslave white folks. So some say this is an important tipping point. So think about how this conflict leads to some really complicated outcomes. Again, there are a bunch of conflicts. There are wars in the South, especially among Native peoples, over several decades, right? Between these societies as they're expanding and the Native peoples that are seen as being in the way. Right? Seen as being in the way. We'll talk more about that process of how they're seen as in the way and what's going to happen with that. The Glorious Revolution. They mentioned the Glorious Revolution in the Crash Course video. There's a revolution in the old world, but when there's fighting in the old world, there's also fighting among their supporters here in the new world. And there will be implications here in the new world of the Glorious Revolution. The outcome of this Glorious Revolution will be that the new monarchs, William and Mary, think William and Mary University in Virginia. There will be new monarchs, but it also kind of trickles here to the new world. There's King William's War. But most importantly, I want you to pay attention to the textbook talks about the last of these conflicts. Essentially the last of these conflicts, which is going to be the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. Same conflict, 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. That's going to end in 1763. 1763. Now that one is seen as especially significant because England finally wins. England is finally able to defeat the pesky French and kind of kick the French largely out of the area. They get Canada as a result of this, and they win. So everybody celebrate. Yay, we won. We finally got rid of the French. England, this and that. But as soon as they win, the bill comes. Now, I don't know about you. I think I told you about my circle of friends before. I know some guys that are big eaters. I got about 15 college buddies. If we ever go out to the same restaurant, we could shut that place down because they could eat more than me, right? Waiters and waitresses and cooks are like, oh no, it's them again, right? And we could just sit down and just destroy a buffet. But what I've noticed is that every now and then, when you go out with some good friends, right around the time the bill comes, you might have been there with 15 people, but when the check is arriving, all of a sudden there's a bunch of people, I gotta go to the bathroom. I got a text, I gotta get out of here. Here, look, here's $5, just pay my part. For some reason, people start disappearing. Oh, I forgot my wallet. You think you could? That's kind of what happens at the end of the 7 Years' War. Britain gets the bill, and they're like, hey, you gotta chip in. And we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. You're the mother country. Right? That's not our role. We're children. And Britain's like, we're fighting to defend you. This is going to lead to conflict. This is going to really sort of put us on the road to revolution, as we'll see next time. Right? So this conflict is important for several reasons. Number one, a lot of these conflicts will force people in different colonies to begin thinking of themselves as an imagined community. Many of them will unite to fight against native peoples. In the same way they will fight to put down slave revolts. There's a slave revolt in Stono, South Carolina in 1739. Other colonies will send troops to help. Why is that important? Well, people are acting like a nation, right? Why would someone in Massachusetts care if there's a native conflict in South Carolina? It doesn't affect them, right? But like we talked about, it does affect you if you feel like you're a nation. If conflict is happening anywhere, then you're impacted by it, kind of like we talked about with some of those 9/11 examples, right? It's not just about geography. So I think these conflicts are important for many reasons, but that's going to be one of the ones we focus on. What does it lead to? How does it get us on the road to revolution? We don't have time to deal with all the details, and I would argue we don't necessarily have to deal with all of that. What we're going to do is use it for our purposes in a way that makes sense in our context. So think about these middle colonies. How do they relate to New England? How do they relate to the South? Think about the significance of this conflict, but most importantly, how is it going to help us understand notions of imagined community? How is it going to help us understand this period of time